Okay, welcome all to the 6th edition of the Sephardi Modernity Seminar, co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University and the Calgary Institute for the Humanities at the University of Calgary with the support of the Belzberg Program for Israel Studies. This year's series, titled Diasporas, Sephardi Perspectives, is organized as always by Angy, Cohen, and me, Yuval Evri. This is the second session of our 2026 seminar. Each year, we are both surprised and deeply encouraged by how many people continue to join us, and we remain especially grateful to those who have attended this project from its very beginnings. This year, we take diaspora as a central lens for understanding the modern and contemporary Sephardi world. By engaging Sephardi histories across the imperial, colonial, and post-colonial context, the series explores questions of multiple belonging, identity formation, migration and return, continuity and rupture, and the circulation of culture, labor, and memory. Our speakers examine how Sephardi communities have navigated life between centers and peripheries, often redefine ideas of home, tradition, and modernity along the way. We opened the series with a lecture by Professor Devinar, who approached diaspora through Edgar Morin's notion of multi-rootedness, challenging the idea of Jewish rootlessness while also resisting ranked models of belonging. Drawing on Judeo-Spanish culture production in the United States, Devinar offered a rich framework for thinking about Sephardi diasporic trajectories across generations. Today's session turns to the formation of another major Sephardi diaspora in the United States, the Moroccan Jewish diaspora. We are honored to welcome Professor Aomar Boum, one of the leading scholars of modern Moroccan Jewish history. His lecture is titled Fashioning Diaspora, Moroccan Jewish Histories in Los Angeles. Drawing on over a decade of ethnographic research, Professor Boum examines how Moroccan Jews in Los Angeles have negotiated Sephardi identity and economic participation through fashion work. He traces how family networks and community ties translated sartorial expertise into economic and social capital within the city's fashion industry. Aomar Boum is historical anthropologist and professor of anthropology, history, and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA, where he holds the Maurice Amado Endowed Chair in Sephardic Studies. A resident member of the Academy of the Kingdom of Morocco, he is the author of Memories of Absence, How Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco, and the Holocaust and North Africa, and co-editor or author of several recent works, including Wartime North Africa and the graphic novel Undesirables, a Holocaust journey through North Africa. He currently serves as interim director of the UCLA Center of Near Eastern Studies. Before we begin, a quick note on format. The talk will last approximately 45 to 50 minutes, followed by about 30 minutes of discussion. Rois Shukun will be moderating the chat, and you are very welcome to post your questions there. And if you would like to ask a question live, please note this in the chat and wait for your turn. Some of you may be wondering where Angy Cohen is today. Unfortunately, she is not feeling well and won't be able to join us today. And we are sending her all our love and wishes to a speedy recovery. So with all of that, it is my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Professor Boum.
Thank you, Yuval, and thanks, Roy, and thanks for everyone for being here. Let me share my PowerPoint. Okay, sorry. Oops, can you see it? Excellent. So let me begin by saying what this project is about. This is a project that I've been in the making for the last, I would say, 10 years, close to now 10 years and a half. It's a research that I started with members of the Moroccan Jewish community here in Los Angeles in particular. And as I started doing interviews with with rabbis in synagogues, people in their homes, in their businesses, over Zoom and over the phone and WhatsApp, because the community also, I try to trace the community to Morocco, to Canada, to some parts of Israel and France. So this is, for me, it's a project about people who are moving around, Moroccan Jews who moved around the world and who settled in LA. So it's a story of a history of the Jewish community, Moroccan Jewish community in LA, using fashion and leather and using fashion as a window to study this community. So there are few studies that were done about Moroccan Jewish dress that go back to the colonial period and the post-colonial period. One of the most important one is done during the 1930s by Jean Besancenot, who is an ethnographer, a French ethnographer, somebody who was also into illustrator, an artist interested in dress, and did a study mostly in the South among different Moroccan Jewish groups in the South, in southern Morocco. And through these studies, he published a few books as well as articles. And then later on, you start seeing some ethnographers, mostly Israeli ethnographers who came in the late 1940s, early 50s, and start also recording this tradition. But from a historical perspective, I would say that the most important scholar when it comes to the study of what's Moroccan dress and Moroccan clothing is Yedida Stillman. And you have also other biographies that were written by other families, especially the Sasson family, which is a family of tailors of the Sultan. That's you got this whole history of tailors that were connected with the government, but also tailors that were just part of the normal daily affairs of cities across the country and villages across the country. So where is this study that I'm looking at coming from? It's coming from my early project that I've done on memories of absence, how Muslims remember Jews in Morocco. That's around here in this village in the south called Akka. And then as I started looking at the writings of Charles de Foucault, who wrote probably one of the most important travel narratives about Jews, rural Jews as well as urban Jews in Morocco in the late 19th century. He talks about Akka, but also he talks about another group called Dibdu, another village called Dibdu. And these happen to be very important villages, and not only as far as the trans-Saharan trade route, but also as far as nodes in the larger network of commerce and population movement, especially Jewish movement in the Sahara as well, and in this area which we call the L'Oriental, which connects not only Fez to the rest of the south, at least the southeastern part of Morocco, but also it connects Dibdu to Melilla and then Spain. So this interest comes from how these communities connected, and part of this connection, I'm looking at the movement of articles and commodities. So that leads me to speaking about the most important family from this region, which is the Marciano family. And I will get back to that. So the Marciano family, which later on, 4 brothers of one clan of these family ended up in LA and built one of the global brands, the Guess brand. So the Marciano families started from Dibdu, and then this is the trace, what I call the floating of object, but also how floating of object, this is a technical term I use, is connected also to movement and settlement of people in different places. And as they move from different places, they bring with them the knowledge that they acquired in their home, and then they either refine it or they take it somewhere else to connect and to settle in communities around the world. So I'm looking at these movement of these groups, not only the Marciano families, but other groups like the Bohbot, like the Perez, like the Rimocht, and so on and so forth. Different families that came either from Fez or from Marrakesh or from Dibdou or from Akka, and so on and then settled in Paris, where they began a project in Le Sentier, and from Paris they ended up in Chabanel, in Montreal, and from Chabanel they ended up in LA, in downtown Garment District. So this story is every family has a chapter in these elements. So to understand really the way the Moroccan Jewish community in LA settled, you have to go through the garment industry, and you have to connect it also to its own cultural heritage as well as religious heritage. So there is the Moroccan Jewish community now, I would say in LA, it's between $20,000 to $30,000, to 20 to 30,000 inhabitants. Some of them, the first generation came directly from Casablanca. They were connected to to World War II, and then you start seeing by the 1950s, people start moving to Canada, settling in Canada for a little bit, and then from Canada, once they set up network in LA, they moved to LA. A few came directly at the beginning from Israel via Morocco. So that would come later in the 1980s, 1990s. And currently now you have an emerging population that is coming directly from France. So what we can say is that now we have between 30 to 40,000 Moroccan Jews actually live today in LA. And they are located in Inglewood, Ladera Heights. This is the early settlement, in San Fernando Valley, in West Hollywood, in Beverly Hills, and Pico Robertson. And you can see here, this is some type of a distribution of this population around the greater LA. As I said, the first temple, the first community, I would say the first Moroccan synagogue is in the valley. It's called the Emhabanim Sephardic Federation. This is where I did most of the study. Most of the interviews were done with members of this community. The synagogue was established in 1974. And you can see here that some of these founders, some of these early founders in 1974. This is a community that's very vibrant, going back to especially starting from the 1980s and 1990s. It has its own social activities, it has own social networks, culture networks, and it's also connected to, even though it's established in the valley, it's connected to other communities also across the city. It is a community that from just some of the images here, that it highlights its connection to Morocco and to the Moroccan Jewish tradition. That's a very central part of how it seizes itself, but also part of its connection to its Jewish tradition. It's also it does not reflect it publicly speaking, and that's where I will get to the argument I'm going to be making about what is Sephardic in this community and how we can discuss it as a Sephardic diaspora. And the last point here, you can see even one of the community became really important with the arrival of Rabbi Chaim Luk in the 1980s, and then left in around 2001 before he went back to Israel. And so there is it's not only a community that's coming from different origins of Morocco, from Marrakesh, Fez, Tangier, Tetuan, the south, all over the country, but it's also a community that kept the liturgical traditions of Morocco alive. It centers that as part of its being, even though it's part of this global city, which we call LA. And within that, in its culture and tradition, it also maintained the importance of the Moroccan dress, the Moroccan cultural habits in terms of weddings, and so on and so. So this is a this is within the synagogue. Sometimes you find these exhibits of this tradition. That's a reminder to the younger generation as well as the older generation where they're coming from. Now, with this background, what I want to say, I want to now take you to highlight what I'm trying to argue here. I'm arguing three things here. I'm arguing the fact that making and connecting this argument by using and referencing and borrowing terminologies from three major works. The first work is called, basically, Funds of Knowledge. And what the point I'm making here is that people are competent and have knowledge, and life experience give them that knowledge, and over time they refine it and they build on it. So this knowledge of cloth making, fashion is coming from somewhere. And as these people move around, and I will give a unique example. Instead of talking about many of these companies or many of these groups which are doing interviews with at least 50 families, I want to focus only on the Marciano and the Guest family. And then over time, when they move to a place, depending on how they feel about the place, they can either foreground this heritage or they can background it. So this is where Goffman argument comes from, is that the fact that Moroccan Jews, when they arrived to LA, for a majority of them, did not publicly express themselves as Moroccans. They do it mostly on the background, in the synagogues, in their homes, and so on. And that's it. And then, but that changes over time. So this is what I call the de-ethnicization of the sartorial de-ethnicization. The idea that you don't exhibit who you are as a part of an ethnic group in the market, in this fashion market. You do it sometimes when it fits the business. So over time, you don't see that in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000. Most of these groups define themselves as French companies because of the fashion, or Italian. So they play on the Italian fashion and French fashion heritage. But then today, recently, you can see some of these changes, even with Guess. They're marketing themselves as a Moroccan because of how Morocco, quote unquote, is cool today as far as tourism and so on and so forth. So that's and then the third point is that borrowing some of the work that used by Yana Gisaki, her work in Italy on family and network. And so most of these projects are not solitary fashion projects. These are projects that are connected to family networks. And from these family networks, you start seeing an expansion of the business and the contraction depending on the relationship between the family groups. So the key point for me are these two things: the funds of knowledge and the backgrounding and the foregrounding of the identity in the diasporic experience. So let me begin by where I'm going to focus here on give you a specific case study of the Marcianos, and I'll explain to you and I'll show where this is coming from based on this argument I'm making and how it exhibited itself in the landscape of the fashion industry in Los Angeles. So I start this through I started doing some interviews back in early post-2010 in Debdu, and collecting information from different families that are scattered not only in Morocco, but also in France and in some parts of the United States and Israel. And this is an excerpt that I take from the Undesirables, where I talk about the story of this German Jew who fled the Nazis and ended up in one of the camps in Algeria, and then he fled through Dibdou before the Operation Torch. So the story begins with, of course, in 1978, 79, when four brothers, this is Paul, Maurice, and George, came to LA via France because of the changes that were taking place during the Mitterrand government. And they established this company, this gene company, that is in some way the biggest innovation of this company comes from what we call the three zippers, the genes with the three zippers, and that's really what launched this group. This is the finality of this family that is part of a big clan called the Marciano clan in Dibdou. There were two clans. There was the Cohen clan and the Marciano clan. That's the finality of this. But we have to go to understand where this is coming from. You have to go back to the 13th, 14th century Spain, and especially to Murcia. Why is this important? Because, and this is, we begin with archaeology. There was a study that done recently by a group of Spanish archaeologists in the castle of Lorca. And then you can see here, this is a castle where you have most of the things you see here in green are basically different houses, part of the Jewish community of Lorca. They're around late 13th century, early 14th century, sorry, late 14th century, late 14th century. And then you see the synagogue is around here, and these are all these homes. So what they've done, what these archaeologists were looking for, they were looking for the remain, or how can you understand basically diet and what people were eating. That's part of the things that they were looking for. And of course, by looking at that, they were also trying to find out what kind of cultural and agricultural habit they have. And they were mostly involved in farming, partly, at least with it through a business partnerships with members of the community, and also herding. So the idea of leather work was embedded or central to this community of the Murcia Jewish community that the Marcianos that ended up in Dibdou were part of. So the Marcianos come from a long tradition of families that were involved in leather work. And from that leather work, you have also these rabbis also who were part. This is the excavation of the synagogue in Lorca. And they were found, some of the archaeologists also found out that this is also a community that was skilled at what we call basically scribes, which later on, the connection between leather again and scribes in Dibdou will become also central to how we understand the emergence of these families that became cobblers. This is the excavation, the actual excavation that you see from that was recently done and was published in 2024. So fast forward, once post-Inquisition, once a lot of these families who were living in Murcia and in Seville would come to and settle in Dibdou, in this area called around the Mulwiya Valley in northeastern Morocco. And they bring those same traditions of herding through partnerships with, now not with Spaniards, but with Muslims, with this group from the Bani Mathar. And you can see here, this is one of the individuals from Bani Mathar in Morocco. It's an image that was taken around the 1980s in this area where Dibdou is located, where Jews from Murcia arrived. And then they became here. We have now a tradition of what we call the the Bergant or the Bergam sheep that really grazing in this area, and that led over time to the management not only of sheep and later on they would add goats later on, but also the revival of the traditions that they had in Mercia through leather work, as well as clothing now that becomes part of their experience, starting from the 15th century and the 16th century. So this is a map that highlights this. You have here, this is a you have here let me just move the you have here basically the population would move through different, first of all around 1392 before, or 1391-92, you start seeing a movement to Italy. Before then they start coming to Nador, and then you'd have some movement or early settlement in Fez from the Jews of Mercia. But then, because of the competition they had with the Jews of Fez in the late 14th century, early 15th century, they would move and they would settle in Dibdu. Why? Because Dibdu gave them the same protection in the borderland, as far as the borderlands between the north and the south and Fez, that they had experienced in Mercia, in the valley close to Mercia. So that's approximately explained what I call here how geography mattered as far as how this community would revive and maintain those same funds of knowledge that they would that they had in Spain. So the Marciano itinerary you got two movements, 1392 to 1492. They would come from Mercia. They would have settled partly in Italy before they moved to Oran and Tlemcen, and before finally they settled in Dibdu. Their occupation, as you'll see from what they described, they were physicians, they were rabbis, scribes, tailors, mostly tailors, jewelry makers, cobblers, and community leaders, and to some extent they were also ambassadors to Sultan. These are similar things when I say ambassadors and translators. They were also partly involved in this in Spain, especially between 1391 and before 1492, and that tradition also will be maintained. The translation as well as the translation occupation will also be became also part of their professions even when they moved to Morocco. Unlike the rest of Morocco, Jews made up in this area in Dibdu, they made up about, I would say, the 3/4 of the whole population. So this is a largely Jewish community in Dibdu. The numbers actually in 1880s, as described by Charles de Foucault, from 2,000 inhabitants in the region, you have about 1,500 were Jewish, and they had a regular trade with Tlemcen, Algeria, and the Mediterranean ports of Melilla and the interior city of Fez. There were about 250 Jewish families in Dibdu, representing this 1,500, representing two major groups: the Cohen and the Cohen, and the Marcianos. And there were also a few other families or lineage organized into clans. So this is really important because in some way they're very similar to some Jewish communities in Tunisia as far as this clan-based organization. This is the Marciano, just from the Marciano families were about 40 clans, included 100 families, just the Marciano families. And this is a breakdown of all of the different clans within the Marciano families: the Bletcher, the Bene Akko, the Lehrer, the Limama, Khilal, Benazwir, Bene Bihi, so on and so forth. And those are breaking down into extended families, which is something really unique in this part of Morocco. You don't see it in many villages or towns in Morocco. We have this number of clans that sometimes they are fighting against each other within the clans. Yeah. So I want to stress this idea that takes us back. Why that I will the idea of the funds of knowledge, that Dibdu was not only a natural resource that allowed the maintenance of herding that's needed for leather working and cloth making in this region, because you have now you're raising sheep that needed for these professions, but it will also be part of, it will also be connected to the synagogues, which will be also connected to learning. It will also be connected to scribe and even Torah writing too. Okay, so that those are also central as far as how all of these, you have all these activities are revolved around herding in many parts. This is a panoramic view of Dibdu, surrounded by mountains, what's called the Mulwiya Valley and the Mulwiya River. Charles de Foucault describes it, where he talks about olive trees, grapevines, figs, all kind of horticulture was taking place here. There is no surrounding walls because it was protected by the mountains. And also it revolved around a lot of springs. This is the actual village, or the actual quote-unquote Mallah. This is an image that was taken in around 1910 by a French photographer from Tlemcen. And you can see here the Marinid minaret, because the Dibdu was central to a fight between a dynasty in Algeria and the dynasty of Marinids in Morocco. And it was also important because it was a city or a rural area that divided this borderland between these two dynasties. And then you see the same minaret here. This is what we call the Sbilia or Sevi water spring, the same area, because it was, Dibdu is referred to as Little Sevi, because the early migrants that came from Spain after 1492 were mostly the Cohen that came from Sevilla, and the Marciano will come later from Murcia. And the legend had it that one of the Marciano rabbis was behind this spring, and you see it today in the history, or it's still there. It's still sometimes it still have water in it, but generally it's one of the landmark of the city. Most of these women here, these are postcards, and this is where it starts getting into the clothing, and then these are postcards of women. Most of them are from the Marciano clan that were taken again by Millet, the photographer by the name of Millet, between 1910 and 1915. And it has a unique style because of they're using a lot of natural herbs for the coloring. The green and the blue were central to this type of dress. It's this type of dress that later on would make it to what's going on now in the tourism industry in Morocco. You see these pillows and these cushions, basically, where they are now a reproduction of the same postcard of the Marciano family in these pillows and cushions. Now, for centuries, the Marciano family and the Cohen, they partnered with Muslim shepherds to raise the Beni Gil sheep. This is the sheep called the Beni Gil sheep, and large herds of goats. And these are renowned for its fine wool and durable hides. The breed supplied materials for weaving and shoemaking used by Jewish women, weavers, and by male tailors and cobblers. The sheep skin were also fashioned into high-quality bags that were gifted to members of the French aristocracy by Moroccan sultans. This is where you get into the whole business of what we call Moroccanry, that began and that emerged in 14th, 15th century, where a lot of leather that was imported to France and used in different articles were coming from this region. It was also, because of its closeness to Fez, this leather quality was also treated in the tanneries of Fez, in the famous Shuara tannery of Fez, and then was either moved back to Dibdou to make clothing or to make leather and bags, or exported to France or exported to other cities. And this is where you start seeing. I'm going to go over three elements of what the Marciano were doing here. Three examples: the cobblers in the Dibdou cobblers of the Marciano family. The same store is used now. So I'm giving you, this is the same store that used to be owned by one of the Marciano families, and now owned by a Muslim, 1951, 2001. They were making different styles of shoes depending on the class of the group. So these are famous examples of, or different examples of shoemaking that was coming from Fez, but also with from Dibdou too. There were also tailors. You have a specific styles that's of tailor that coming from Dibdou. Mostly what you call the filigree buttons, the stylized flowers, and the spiral motifs. You can see that they're also, because of their closeness to Fez, some of these styles resemble some of the styles that were also part of the Fezi tradition. And then finally, the leather making was not only connected to scrolls, but also connected to bags and other leather articles that were sold in the markets of Medina of Fez and other cities in the Melilla, or exported to Spain after 18th century. The last point is the idea of the jewelry. The jewelry making in Fez and in Dibdou as well was connected to mines of that were close to the mountains surrounding Dibdou, and that really completes this big, or what they call this tradition, or this knowledge of fashion, leather making, or clothing, leather making, and jewelry making in the region. Just to give you another example, for instance, of where this community used to live. This is I was doing both interviews with Muslims. Most of the information coming from interviews with Muslims who today live in these some of these neighborhoods, although they are empty, and also combining and reading it through the archives, also connecting it to the archive. That's the same street in 1910, same street in 2021. Of course, here you have Millet image, Millet postcard, and this is a picture that I took in 2020 during COVID. And this is one example of the residents that were taken in 1915 by Millet as well. Now, another really interesting part that connects this idea of funds of knowledge related to fashion and leather making is the idea that, and that would also showcase when most of these communities come to LA and will connect with not only their members of the Jewish community at large, but also how they became really central to the survival of synagogues and community organizations. So in Dibdou, you have one of the Dibdou used to train or to produce some of the largest numbers of rabbis in the region. These are rabbis that are trained in the yeshiva of Dibdou by 1916, and then they finish their training sometimes in the rabbinical school of Meknes before they move back to Fez or Dibdu, or they travel to some parts, or they move to some parts of Algeria, in Tlemcen, and some of them end up actually in France, like the father of the Marcianos themselves. The father of the Marciano brothers, the owners of Guess, was the rabbi of Bergen, and he became also the rabbi of Marseille before he came to LA in the 1980s. And then you have this tradition of producing rabbis was also connected to the tradition of producing also scribes, as they said. There is a unique style of tradition that also connected to Murcia in Spain. So you have, this is some of the examples of the signatures of these scribes and rabbis. You can see Rabbi Marciano. These are from the same clan, same family, same clan of the Marciano. And that's finally those, you have about 15 out of 115, 1,500 Jews living in Dibdu by during the 1880s. You have about 15 synagogues in that street that I showed earlier. So that's the context where four brothers, Georges, Maurice, Armand, and Paul, were raised. They were raised in this tradition, what I call the funds of knowledge of jewelry making, leather making, and clothing. They come to Marseille and they become involved in the jeans business, just like many Moroccan Jews, by the way. At a time in the 1980s, where you start seeing a shift in the French economy, high taxes, people are starting to move mostly to Canada, because there is already a network in Canada, given the fact that you speak, and here partly of what Roy's work speaks to that, in terms of you have people speaking French, you have much more close network, the conditions of migration that are different from migrating to the United States. You have supports of the Canadian government that you don't get in the American system. And so you have what we call the first phase of the migration. The Marcianos didn't go through that. They came straight from Marseille to LA. And even at the time where you have the jean business was going through a downhill, the idea of innovating and coming from this project, at least from these traditions of innovation, they allowed them basically to adjust their fashion designs to this changing market. This is some of their first what I call the first phase from Dibdu to Marseille. This is the store location of in Marseille. It's now part of the fashion district in Marseille, which is also going through a lot of changes given the movement of the Asian influence in the city, which is a similar experience that you see also in other markets, especially in the markets here in the fashion district in LA. And by with the 1981, that said, you start seeing this movement now to an expansion with the success of the Marciano, especially in the 1980s. You start seeing the beginning of a movement now of other families, not only coming from France, directly from France, but they're coming from Canada in particular. And those businesses were built around two things, as I said in my introductory note, as far as which is connected to this idea of how, at what moment you foreground your identity in a city where you have Tunisian Jews who are part of also emerging as part of the fashion industry. You have Persian Jews, and you have Iraqi Jews. And you have Jews also, Ashkenazi Jews, coming from the market, the New York market that was already going through a downturn. So that's the choice they made is to highlight the Frenchness and to highlight also this European influence, and that became the marker that allowed them to foreground this identity. This doesn't mean that they were ignoring or forgetting the Moroccanness. The Moroccanness is largely exhibited through the membership in these different synagogues that are spread around LA, and especially the first synagogues at Habanim, but also you have Baba Saleh in West Hollywood, and so on and so forth. So that's the market, the what I call the mark of foregrounding and backgrounding, and that's how this sartorial ethnicization was basically maintained until the turn of the 21st century, where you start seeing a shift from this total silencing and bracketing off of the Moroccan identity. Now it becomes an emergent part, especially of the fashion industry related to the Kaftans and other Moroccan garments. So that shift, this shift, what it signals that now it's okay to market this Moroccan identity, even in a market, in a capitalist system where there is a much more competition between different clothing houses over customers and over especially over customers. So that's what's also interesting. The reason why for me the Marciano case is unique, because from the Marciano case you start seeing what we call, and this is connected to the other cases that were done, projects that were done in Italy, especially the case that I mentioned at the beginning with the Yanagisaki's work in Italy, is that you start now seeing families coming from Canada in particular, partnering and building partnership with the Marcianos in this network of fashion. And that's once this, and of course, what's interesting about it is that it contracts and it expands depending on the relationship between these families and sometimes disagreement, which I don't get into because I made the decision from the beginning that this is much more a historical cultural project that explains how fashion. I'm not interested in the flattening of the business work where we're basically looking at labor. I'm not looking at labor. I'm not looking at statistics or numbers as far as the business. I'm focusing mostly on how these funds of knowledge allow these communities to settle, to maintain the community without forgetting their heritage that comes from rural areas or cities, and sometimes that stretches back into Spain, as I highlighted in this case. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Omar. This is very rich.
Oh, and one last thing, sorry, one last thing, and then I'll finish with this last thing, Siri. Sorry, I'm fasting, so apologies if I sound like I'm losing my voice here. So one point I also want to stress here, it has to do how do you write and how do you showcase and you publish this work. For me, there are two different ways to bring this work to the public. And you saw some images of some art work done by my daughter. And so I'm interested in two things here, in this idea of what I call the illustrated graphic history, which is important way to rethink the way we transmit Sephardic histories. So art becomes, and collaboration with K through 12 and children becomes an important part of doing this. And the other thing, and you can see here that even though I'm explaining this through some, making some argument by drawing on some academic and theoretical work, I'm also interested in the production of this work through coffee table books. And because it allows us to see with the families and with the images and with the artwork, it allows us to see how this movement of this diasporic experience goes from a small store in Fez to a big business and or an advertisement or a billboard in downtown LA or in the district of LA or in Montreal, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, for doing it while fasting and doing it on time, and so rich, so many things that I have, to ask you, and I have many questions. But there is also many questions on the chat. So I will start maybe with two questions. First of all, I'm fascinated by the way you did your research itself, because you could other researchers and historians will do it differently. Will focus only on the transition of the Jewish family leaving Morocco and not go back to Morocco to do the research. And you went back to Morocco, to the place that they came from, and you did part of your research by the memory of the Muslims that used to work with this family and the memory of that funds of knowledge there. So if you can say something, because it's part of your larger project in a way, how to do this research of Jews from the Middle East without forgetting the context of the place that they're coming from, and not only go and travel with them. The second thing is, for me, that is very interesting, is the funds of knowledge on the textile and that will travel elsewhere, right? You say Marseille, but what about Israel? We spoke a bit about it before the Zoom began. In Israel, we know the Moroccan Jews are mainly working factories, but not the owners of these kind of businesses. So if you can say something, if this kind of funds of knowledge also travel to Israel, or maybe travel back from Israel to Los Angeles.
So there are, first of all, thank you for both questions. For me, there are a lot of the cobblers, a lot of people were involved also even in the shift from the traditional form of clothing in Morocco to new forms of clothing and shoemaking with the arrival of the French, did end up in Israel. And they ended up working actually in many factories. So for instance, the Rimoch family, which later on became one of the most important families in LA, and partnered with the Guest family, through especially in not only in bags making. He was managing, Jacques Rimoch was managing this huge, he didn't own the capital, he didn't own the company, but he was just a manager before he moved to New Jersey. There are, yes, some went to Israel, and from Israel they ended up coming to LA or to the United States or Canada. But the people that I interviewed in LA, most of them, the normal routes they had is France or straight Morocco, LA, Morocco, France, Canada, LA, Morocco, Canada, LA. They didn't, even New York. It's interesting, New York didn't feature in their travel, because New York at the time, because of the rise of Hollywood and the need for more clothing in LA, so people were starting to move. The German, it's very similar to the German Schmada business that in the 19th century, very similar in many ways. You have people coming from Germany straight to New York, and then expanded to Philadelphia and to Illinois, and then went back to New York. So that really, the New York model would go down as you have the rise of the what we call the Montreal model and the LA model. So there is I haven't done a lot of interviews and research on cases in Israel, but from the interviews that I've done, definitely a lot of people ended up on in it, but mostly the workers, mostly the regular cobblers, the regular kaftan maker or ksuwal kibir. Those are these companies that changed the makeup and of fashion in LA. These are the people who were influenced by Canada, especially Montreal and Paris. And they did change it. In the 1980s and 1990s, you have the Moroccans, the Tunisians, and the Iraqis, and to some extent also the Persians.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, well, E, do you have any question? Or your
I
research
do.
is really, really connected, and your family background as well.
Yes. First, let me just say that this is so fascinating to go back so many centuries. Also, for the creation of the conditions for this kind of network to expand. And it's I said earlier, but I didn't even realize what I was saying before when I said that this was personally connected to me because of my father. But my grandmother is also actually Martiano, from whose parents are from Debdu, and she's from Taurit. So this is really fascinating for me to hear.
We have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we should talk. And also they ended up in Israel, in Kiryat Malachi in Jerusalem. So there's and I know that they were able to bring some of their networks there as well. But I think it was at that time in automobiles and not in clothes. But this is another conversation. I do want to ask about two things. One thing is as what happens in one of the things that happens in Montreal with the Moroccan migrations over different generations is that they sort of split into certain different groups. They talk to each other and they get together, but the Israeli Moroccans and the Moroccans who immigrated directly from Morocco, sometimes they go to the same synagogues, but the networks are sometimes very separate, and they don't always go to the same kind of community events. There's French, and then there's the Hebrew, and then if you bring in the Spanish speakers, it's a whole. I mean, what were previously the Spanish speakers, it's a whole other thing. So I'm wondering what happens in LA with those different groups, if they're layered in the same kind of way, and then other question with that one is, how does that work? Intra-ethnically with Ashkenazi Jews who come from the East Coast, because you obviously in Montreal we have this kind of ethnic conflict that happens there, but also a lot of working together. Is there collaboration in LA between different families, Ashkenazi families and Moroccan families that had been, and also other like Iraqi and Persian families that had already been in the business? How do they work together? How do they deal with each other, if they do at all?
Those are great questions. So the first one, the community is mostly French educated. So French dominates there. So you don't have that same problem that or issue, or at least a feature that you see in Canada with the French and English. You don't have that. So and then also, even actually in my interviews, when I do interviews, people mostly start speaking French and Darija and Moroccan. But you do have a lot of sometimes regional differences. Marrakesh, Fez, Tangier, Tetouan, you do have those differences. And because of the spread, this is a city that's a large, where the people, now the Emhabanim are much more older population, originally more grounded with the memory of Morocco. Now you have in the West Hollywood and Beverly Hills now with Baba Saleh and all of these other synagogues, you have mostly people are younger generation. And then you start now seeing more arrival of Israeli Moroccans. We have Hebrew now is part of that. And the third generation or second and third generation of Moroccans whose parents came in the 40s and 50s and the 60s, they're now more American. They speak more English. So it depends on the families. What I would say is that the traditional core is really Emhabanim, the San Fernando. And because it's spread, the connection are much more limited. You have to go to different communities to speak to different groups. because it's a city that you need the cars to drive from one place to another. So that's that. Except that what I see it's unique. I think I would love to see 10 years from now how things would change in Pico Robertson. And now that it's walking distance and more Moroccans are coming from Israel and coming from France at the same time. So that's going to be really fascinating. More Moroccan synagogues in Pico Robertson now. More even publishing houses too, coming from Canada to Morocco. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see this shift. As part of with the Ashkenazi, and I would say it depends on individual families. Some people really want to maintain the connections between the Moroccan community. It's a very what's unique about the community is it's still maintaining its traditions, despite they have and I think Hayim Luk had a lot of credit as far as maintaining this, and that's actually keeps now bringing Morocco reading through the Moroccan schools, and now as more members of the community are coming from Canada. Rabbi Labhar, for instance, who's in Pico Robertson also, is central to this. So this tradition, I think it's the quote unquote the influence of Ashkenazi traditions are very, very limited, not only in terms of marriage tradition rituals, but even in terms of synagogues. What might change is how Moroccan traditions are interacting with what I call the Chabad and Hasidic tradition. That's, as you know, you start seeing the influence of that also taking place in terms of the way Moroccan Judaism is interpreted.
Yeah, so before we get into the questions, I have connected because I wanted to ask also about the cultural aspect and Chaim Luk is one generation, and he became definitely, after coming back to Israel, also very influential in the revival of the piyut in Israel as well, and the Moroccan piyut. But what I see from what I know in LA, as you said, in the end, there is also the Moroccan Mizrahi Israeli culture that's coming, that is very influenced by Hasidic. I'm talking about the Rav Pinto, for instance, have a big center.
Yes.
In LA, many of the Mizrahi Jews will bring there. So if you can say something about how this kind of diasporic community is working with of course, as you said, with the funds of knowledge that comes from Morocco, but also what is the new creation that is being created in LA regarding cultural Moroccan Jewish community, right?
I think one of the things it's doing is making more visible what the market and the traditional fashion really at some point put on the background. The shift in terms of religious interpretation and the diversity of these schools now, they're making it now more visible. You see it in the street. Before, you see only a billboard designed by that belongs to Bizou Bizou, the Bohbot family, or to other brands, and you need to know who is behind the brand to know. Now, because now these religious interpretation, the different schools of interpretation now are making they're visible in terms of their yeshivas, in terms of their synagogues, and that marks the Moroccanness. And also even in terms of publishing too, you see more and more Moroccan publishing is taking place, not only through religious books, but even newspapers. The editor-in-chief of the Jewish Journal of LA is a Moroccan, is this Suissa, and that also puts through the articles and the publishing, it foregrounds also Moroccanness in the city too. So here you have a group that was very, very marginal and key to economy of the city in the 80s and 90s, and now is more and more foregrounded, not only because of what they do in terms of business, but also in terms of other activities and other culture and heritage that they brought with them from their home country, also as a diaspora from different regions.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, Rui, there's any other there's questions I know on the
Yeah, we should probably get to some of the audience questions. So I'll give you a few to answer, and then afterwards we'll move to another few because we have quite a few. And anybody in the audience who wants to ask their questions themselves, please just let me know that you want to do that, and we can go ahead. Joseph Robinson is asking about the Latin American connection from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Adriana Brodsky in the comments gave a short answer, but likes to maybe asks you to possibly expand on that about whether they only came from northern Morocco or also other parts of Morocco. I know this is not exactly the point of your talk, but maybe we can talk about if there's a Latin American connection here that we haven't talked too much about. Let me ask a question from Susan Tannenbaum. Saying that the guest history seems to mention Morocco, as you mentioned. In the later years, they reforeground Morocco, but not so much Jewish ties. Did they identify as Jewish before or afterwards? So she asked if they identify as both in the public sphere. So at any point were they identifying as Jewish? Did that ever help? And the last one, did any other clans, the non-Marciano clans, also go into jeans manufacturing?
That's great. So let me begin by, yes, I found few cases of fashion designers, but also people involved in the clothing business in general, who came via Mexico, mostly Mexico, and interestingly, not Brazil, Mexico and Venezuela. Few cases to LA too, but of course, as Adriana and Orino and other people worked on the migration from the north straight to the Americas. That's a different story, but what I call this basically different stages of migration before settling in the one place. The Latin American case is very limited. As I said, the dominant examples that I've seen are coming from Mexico. But compared to Montreal is, I would say, 80% or between 80 to 90% of the relocation is coming from Montreal. Yeah. So the genes. It was, I can name, there are so many names for as far as the genes business. So everybody was involved in the Jewish in the jeans business in the 80s. So the jeans and what you call the t-shirts business, and then you start seeing people start to diversify. So what you start seeing, what's interesting is that starting from the late 1980s, and this is where the bohbot becomes important here. You have a family coming from Paris, and they start basically a woman with her husband, Mark, Michel Bohbot and Mark Bohbot, really start diversifying and moving away to some extent from that, and then bringing in what we call the bag business, the women's bag business, and also expanding that to watches and other things, which the guest was really pioneering as far as the what we call the diversifying of the portfolio, of the market portfolio. So the jeans at the moment where all these big, for instance, the Timsit family, which is originally partly from Casablanca and Rabat, but mostly Rabat. Timsit family this is a Moroccan Jew from Rabat making American jeans in the 70s and 80s, and it was an empire basically. He was one of the few cases where he played on this Moroccan humor and Moroccan identity. So he had a brand called Duido, Little David basically, and American apparel. So all of that, from 1981, I would say, until 1987, 88, the genes were central. And then you have, of course, the new companies now, the what we call high fashion genes now are now, most of them are Moroccans. Joe's genes is Moroccan. What do you call this is a gene that just actually been I forgot the name, but most of the high fashion genes right now are mostly Moroccan brands. And then you can see is this idea that this expansion of family network continues even in the downturn of the jeans business in today's America.
Okay, let me continue with some more questions. Itzhak Kerem is asking a question about Italian Jewish families in fashion. We mentioned, of course, families originally coming from Spain centuries ago, and we had very influential networks with between Tunisia and Livorno in Italy and everything. Do these also play a role? Shayna Weiss is asking, was there a garment district in LA like there was in NYC, which was a place of gathering and connecting for Ashkenazi Jews involved in textiles. And she's also saying that she's happy to connect you to, there's a Marciano branch in Boston, and she's happy to connect you to that if you'd like.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, the garment district in LA is probably one of the most interesting. It's just like Chabanel in some way when you look back to history in Montreal. It has everything, and it's partly, I think, it's because of the rise of the Hollywood. It has everything from the washing, from everything can be made just in this area that I showed in the PowerPoint in downtown LA. So that's really what made it really. And of course, at some point, the Moroccans were not as would come later when it comes to, and if you compare them to especially the Persians, there is this really important competition between the Persians and the Moroccans. The Tunisians were also central at the beginning, and partly Iraqis too. Partly you have also Iraqi, not a lot of Lebanese. So it's something that I think has to do with that shift that it started to take place in the 50s and 60s, and Montreal was key to that before, and then but once you get into the 70s and 60s, late 60s and early 70s, downtown LA and the fashion district in LA becomes also would basically erase all the importance of New York as a center that's influenced by the German migration, which I think when I think about the Moroccan case, there are so many similarities with the German case in the 19th century, especially if you think about them in terms of family network and family connections.
Let me I remind the question about the Italian Jewish families, and let me ask a question by Adriana Brodsky. And also, I want to mention that I think I forgot to mention, my father had a store in Chabanel, a clothing store in Chabanel. So it's really amazing to hear. So Adriana Brodsky is asking, leaving aside the knowledge that these families could draw from to decide what to do in terms of business that you so beautifully painted, what were the conditions in the countries in which they settled that could explain the success with their activities?
That's a great question. That's central. So in Canada, what we have is this idea of the peddler discourse, basically, still a quote unquote, the idea that you buy things and then you go. So if you look at, for instance, Aldo Ben Sadoun, the shoemaker there. So his family, his father, he had a shoe business coming from Algeria, settled in Fez, shoe business in Fez starting from the 1920s. And then when he didn't have this idea of basically, and I did some interviews with Aldo Ben Sadoun, who's I think an incredible. These are incredible human beings, basically, in terms of their what they. I think when you think about fashion, sometimes we forget that's why talking these stories, human part of these stories, shed lights on these families and what they stand for, and when you look at Aldo, when he started his schooling in Cornell before he went back to Canada, where he started selling encyclopedias, and then he got into this idea of selling in this specific spots in some of the business or some of the apartments in Chabanel, these shoes, and then from there you go from selling and then going from store to store to becoming basically having enough credit or enough money to start your own business. So those are conditions that different from the US in some way. The US was really about bringing a different style, I think, and then of course this capitalist mode of that somehow differs from Canada to some extent, but still connected to it. That it really allowed some of these families like the Marciano and many other families to thrive at the beginning. And then they start basically, given these connections and family connections, they start partnering, bringing other people, partnering with other people. So for instance, Marciano would partner with Davids and the shoemaker, Davids and Charles Davids. Charles Davids would expand to the shoe business because most of the Moroccans who were in Canada were largely in the shoe business, which is really interesting here. And then you have, so those conditions depend on how they read the market too. So having that knowledge of reading the market and what works and what doesn't work really allowed these families to thrive, which did not, and also the conditions, the capitalist and financial conditions worked in Paris, in Canada and in the US versus France, for instance. At a moment where you have a shift in the economy by the socialist new government under Mitterrand in France would basically be a key factor in the shift.
That's fascinating. And I imagine another shift, but before I just ask another question, I imagine another shift is the turn to online ordering for fashion directly from Asia, from online websites that makes it difficult for independent stores to arrive. This is at least what I think about when I think about these shifts in the clothing market at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century.
This is new. I don't deal a lot with that. What I focus mostly on is the period between interwar period, late 1940s all the way to the 1990s, late 1990s. So that's what really I have to do more work and more to focus on to see how the internet and how basically transformed this business, which it does, but I don't deal with that. Yeah, because I'm really interested in, again, that answers the question about the diaspora and how these communities also thrive and emerge in a new space that they're not familiar with, given the fact that even migration, when you look at migration, Moroccan migration, Muslim and Jewish migration to the US is really new. It's a new, you go back to few cases of migration in the 18th century, 19th century, but the numbers was really, really small compared. You have to wait till post-World War II to start seeing an increase of Moroccan migration, Jewish and Muslim, to the US. More Jewish at the beginning than Muslim, but it expanded later on until you have to wait till the 1990s, for instance, to start seeing more Moroccan Muslims coming to the US.
Let me ask a question by David Benaroche. He says that the Jewish Moroccan community also had many fashion designer stars like Albert Elbaz in Paris, and Elena Benaroche in Madrid. And does the community sorry?
I said of blessed memory, the first one, Albert, yeah.
Does the community in LA have an influence in the fashion design industry as well in the city of LA? And do you know any notable designers from the community there?
Yes, yeah, because most of the you have a lot, all of these, the majority of these owners are also designers, majority of them. Yeah, yeah. I want to give a shout out to my friend Vishal Grishi. I think it's very hard. As an anthropologist, it's very hard to do a study on businesses. It's really hard. So you have to be, it requires trust. It requires a lot of also commitment, and also you explain exactly what you need from these projects. There are things that some people will want to hear, and then you can look at the newspapers and reports and legal reports and all of these things. But I'm interested in just telling the story of this community, this diasporic community, and how they adjusted and settled and maintained the community without ignoring their roots. So Richard Grishi was my entry point. These are people who allowed me to get to synagogues, attend homes, look at their businesses, and I'm hopefully people can expand this and do other explain this and talk about this project in different ways. But for me, my objective is really to highlight the foundation of cultural and historical foundation of how these things took place, and how we can talk about this community as a diaspora community connected to, unique in its way, because it really emerges from a fashion industry and clothing industry, and it allowed the community to survive as a religious community also through the support of these fashion designers and fashion clothing companies. Without them, you will not hear about every synagogue you see here in the city in LA is in some way or another funded by benefactors from this community. So I just want to say that, sorry, Roy, just as an acknowledgement, because sometimes we forget to thank people. I want to thank these members of these communities, and especially Richard and other members, and both rabbis and business owners. Yeah.
You never have to apologize for thanking people who helped. It's very, very important to do, of course. But then maybe it's a good moment to ask about the future of this project. Where is it going, and what is your intended what form does this project take as you are sort of coming together with 10 years of research that is sort of culminating now? How does this look?
That's a great. So I am working now on an illustrated book with my daughter, in the same way that I did the book about my dad. And because for me, it's important to talk to this generation of younger generation about this history, and to use their own, what they know, which is the image and the visual. So it's a visual project where my daughter is doing drawing, watercolor based on material we already have in the archives, and then I'm writing a text about it, and then it's very similar to a project we did about my father called The Last Raqqas, and that's one part of it. So it's a book directed to a wider audience, but at the same time, hopefully it could be used by K through 12, or at least for a younger generation. And then the second part is this what I call, I'm finishing a version of this project as a coffee table book. It ruined my budget, because just to get the images from the Getty, you're talking about, for every image you have to pay $500, $1,000, $2,000. So it's a very expensive project. But I think it's the text is done, and I'm now putting it together, and hopefully by the end of this year, early 2027, the coffee book table will be out. It won't be heavy on theory, but it will be just basically explaining how these. So it's used a lot of images, but also a lot of text, and it showcases the first arrivals, first synagogues, and how they connect, and you move from one family to another. So it's, in a way, it's a family network story through the brand. So every family is connected to a brand, and how this brand also either stops, or from it comes another brand, and so on and so on. But those are the two projects I have in mind now. And hopefully, and of course, as we do in for evaluation and as academic, we write articles. So I have a few articles also that are now in the pipeline based on some of this research.
It's super fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So we have 4 minutes, and but I think that you really did the really finishing statement here. So I don't know if we get another, because I have another question, but I don't know if we have enough time. But I will put it maybe out there, because I think it's part of your larger project again. And for me, I'm always interested when this kind of diaspora, because you said that the origin of this kind of funds of knowledge is Jewish-Muslim collaboration in Morocco, of working together and localized in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
And when it's travel to Marseille and then to Los Angeles, can you see the Jewish-Muslim collaboration continue, or you see a rupture, or you see that it's becoming only a Jewish phenomenon or network? What's happened with the Muslim-Jewish, seeds of that, if this continuing with the travels outside of Morocco?
Unfortunately, it doesn't travel. What travels is the idea of Morocco, the memory of Morocco. That travels, and some people go back to it. What's interesting is that you have families who go back to now visit these spaces. So I wouldn't call it so that memory is there. The memory of, and you hear it in the synagogues, you hear it with the people that you interview, but in actual collaboration, no. Actual people, Moroccan Muslims working with some of these companies, yes. There are a lot of Moroccans in LA, Muslims who are working for and have collaborated with some of these companies. So, but it's not in the way it used to be in this context of Dibdu, for example. It's not, and it has to do with again, as from your work and Roy's work, it has to do with closeness, spatial closeness. So, and then also the conflict that's in the Middle East and all of these, and then we have also everything is also happening online. So so I think closeness allows that. So that's why the Dibdu case was a fascinating case. In the same way, Murcia, even at the moment where you have rise of anti-Jewish discourse, anti-Semitism, which led to the Inquisition, you still see Muslims and Jews were working in that space between Seville and Castilian. So I think, do I see a possibility of this? I think I know I don't know to what extent this is happening, but there is a lot of some of these companies are going back and trying to build connections and businesses in Morocco. Would that revive those? For instance, in terms of the Kaftan case, you have the one of the Moroccan designers. What's his name? Waknin? No, yeah, is it Waknin? Yeah, he has his company is based in Casablanca. He makes Moroccan kaftans in Casablanca, works with Moroccan Muslims and Jews in Casablanca. So that's one case. That's one case.
No, but the memory is very important, and your
but the memory is
because you did part of your research there, and people still remember it, and it's still part of the place and the memory. Okay, so thank you very much, Omar. That was fascinating. Really, really thank you. We're really looking forward for all the outcomes of this research that's going to come out, inshallah, soon. Thank you very much, Roy, for everything, for your questions, and for your, all the work and collaboration together in this project. And thank you, Freddie, for all your work, technical work behind the scenes. And thank you everyone that stayed with us and joined us. And we're going to see you next time, inshallah, soon. So thank you very much.
And please make sure you read Roy's work. He's a really
yes, fascinating. Fascinating work.
When it comes to knowing more about the Montreal and Canada, I think it's one of the best work out there. I really do.
I appreciate that. Everyone should also read Omar's work, or should read Omar's work.
Definitely.
And Yuval's.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, man. Thank you,
Bye.
Omar.
See you
Thank
next
you, Freddie.
time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.